When historians sit down to talk about the First World War, the conversation almost always lands on the same images. Trenches flooded with mud, artillery barrages that shook the earth for miles, machine gun nests cutting down entire columns of men, and all of that was devastating enough. But there is one chapter that tends to get skipped over, not because it was minor, but almost because it was too disturbing to sit with: chemical weapons. No other tool in that war dismantled the human body with the same cold, calculated efficiency. That is exactly what we are going to examine today. And before we go any further, if you are eating right now, or if you are someone who tends to carry difficult images with you after watching something, this is your moment to step away. What follows is historically accurate, and because of that, it is not easy to hear. Still here? Then let's go back to the beginning. The concept of using poison against an enemy is not a product of the 20th century. Long before European powers were drawing trenches across Belgium and France, ancient armies had already figured out that you did not always need a sword to defeat someone. Defenders of besieged cities had wells poisoned by attackers trying to force a surrender. Smoke carrying irritating compounds was blown toward fortified positions to drive men out into the open. These were not systematic tactics. They were improvised, situational, and generally looked down upon even by the people using them. The reputation of poison as a dishonorable weapon followed it through the centuries and into the modern era. In the years leading up to the Great War, some military chemists and forward-thinking officers did run experiments with toxic compounds, but the results were unimpressive and the attitude remained the same. Poison was seen as the weapon of the coward. Artillery was honorable. Gas was not. Military planners largely dismissed the idea entirely. That was about to change in ways none of them had imagined. The war that European generals expected to be over by Christmas of 1914 instead locked itself into something nobody had a plan for. The Western Front became a wall. Both sides dug in, and the combination of rapid-fire artillery, machine guns, and early air reconnaissance made traditional advances suicidal. You could not outflank a line that stretched from the English Channel to the Swiss border. You could not charge across open ground without being cut apart before you reached the other side. Every offensive bled out. Every breakthrough got sealed off. The stalemate was total, and the pressure to find something, anything, that could break it was immense. That pressure is what opens the door to the darkest inventions. And what came through that door next would change warfare permanently. The Germans had chlorine sitting around as a byproduct of their industrial chemical production. The idea of deploying it against Allied trenches was raised, debated, and eventually approved. But there was a legal obstacle. The Hague Peace Conference of 1899 had produced a declaration in which the major powers agreed not to use projectiles designed specifically to disperse asphyxiating or harmful gases. The 1907 Hague Convention reaffirmed this. Read those words carefully, though, and you will notice something. The restriction was on projectiles. It said nothing about simply opening a valve and letting the wind do the rest. German military planners identified this gap and decided that releasing gas directly from pressurized cylinders placed along the front line would not technically violate the agreement. Whether that reasoning was sincere or purely convenient is another question entirely. Over the weeks leading up to late April 1915, German troops quietly moved more than 5,000 chlorine cylinders into position along a stretch of the front near Ypres in Belgium. They waited. They needed the right wind direction, steady enough to carry the cloud forward without dispersing it too quickly. On the evening of April 22nd, conditions were right. The valves opened. Allied soldiers in the French and Algerian sectors of the line watched something strange drifting toward them across the fields. It was not artillery smoke. It moved differently, lower, slower, with a faint greenish tint catching the last of the light. Some assumed it was a smokescreen masking an infantry advance. They waited for the soldiers behind it. The soldiers never came first. The cloud did. More than 160 tons of chlorine gas rolled across a front nearly 4 miles wide and dropped straight into trenches and dugouts. There were no gas masks. Nobody had designed them yet because nobody had expected this. French Captain Gouraud managed to get a message back to headquarters describing what was happening. The line went dead mid-transmission. He died at his post. Men staggered out of their positions with skin gone gray, eyes bulging, hands at their throats. Most collapsed within a short distance of where they had been standing. In under 10 minutes, an entire section of the Allied front line ceased to exist as a fighting force. More than 1,000 men died immediately. Over 4,000 were severely injured. A 4-mile gap opened in the Allied line, something that had never happened before on the Western Front. German infantry advanced into the gap wearing nothing more than gauze pads soaked in bicarbonate solution over their mouths. They had been told the gas would clear the way. What they walked into stopped even them cold. The bodies they passed had not died quickly, and the positions those men had died in made that fact unmistakable. Even the soldiers advancing through a gap they had just torn open were shaken by what they saw. Despite the breakthrough, the Germans hesitated. No one was entirely sure how safe it was to move through contaminated ground. Some of their own men had caught the edge of the cloud. Follow-up forces had not been positioned aggressively enough. The window to push all the way through to Ypres that night closed, and the opportunity was lost. Chlorine, being heavier than air, kept moving. It rolled into the low-lying ground downwind and into nearby villages, killing civilians and animals far behind the front. On the Allied side, commanders scrambling to close the gap had almost nothing to work with. No gas masks had been issued. The improvised solution, strips of cloth soaked in urine held over the nose and mouth, sounds absurd, but the ammonia it contained did offer some reduction in chlorine's immediate effects. Men who had seen what the gas did accepted the alternative without argument. Before moving to what came next, it is worth pausing to understand what was happening inside the bodies of the men caught in that cloud. Chlorine is heavier than air, which means it does not rise and disperse. It sinks and collects. It flows down into shell craters, drainage ditches, and dugouts. When it makes contact with moisture, it reacts to form hydrochloric acid. Your eyes, the lining of your nose and throat, the interior of your lungs, everywhere the body is naturally wet becomes a target. The lungs take the worst of it. Deep inside them are tiny air sacs responsible for transferring oxygen into the bloodstream, and each of those sacs is lined with a thin layer of moisture. Chlorine reaches them, reacts, and converts that moisture into acid. The tissue swells. Fluid begins to accumulate. Gradually, the spaces that should be full of air fill with liquid instead. The technical cause of death from chlorine exposure is drowning. Not metaphorically. Actually drowning from the inside out with nothing anyone around you can do about it. Chlorine had broken the barrier. Once it was used, every major power began developing its own chemical program. Within months, something far worse entered the war. Phosgene. Colorless, nearly odorless. Soldiers described a faint smell of fresh-cut hay, the kind of smell you might not even register as a warning. And unlike chlorine, it showed almost no immediate symptoms after exposure. A soldier could inhale a lethal dose, feel mild irritation, and convince himself he had gotten lucky. The effects, fluid building in the lungs, the same mechanism as chlorine but slower and more thorough, would not fully manifest for anywhere between 4 and 24 hours. By the time the symptoms became undeniable, intervention was impossible. The damage was already complete. Phosgene ended up responsible for approximately 80% of all chemical weapon deaths in the First World War. It was not the most visible weapon. It was the most lethal one. Medical personnel dealing with gas casualties consistently described them as the worst cases they encountered, not only because of what the patients were experiencing, but because there was genuinely nothing to be done. Oxygen could be given, but gas attacks produced casualties in large numbers simultaneously, and oxygen supplies at field hospitals were not built for that kind of demand. You could sit with someone and watch and not be able to change the outcome. The third major agent of the war operated on an entirely different principle. Mustard gas, introduced by Germany in 1917, was not primarily a weapon designed to kill. It was designed to wound, to contaminate, and to persist. Delivered in artillery shells that burst into a fine aerosol on impact, mustard settled onto skin, clothing, and soil. It caused no immediate pain. Hours later, Massive fluid-filled blisters would form across any exposed skin. The eyes were particularly vulnerable, and severe exposure could cause temporary or permanent blindness. The fatality rate from mustard was relatively low compared to phosgene, but it accounted for roughly 90% of all gas-related wounds in the war. It also did not dissipate quickly. In cool, damp conditions, mustard could remain dangerous in an area for days, turning ground that had been shelled into a contamination zone that lingered long after the barrage ended. For soldiers on all sides, chemical weapons did not just create casualties. They created a permanent psychological weight that sat on top of every other stress of trench life. Gas alarms became part of the daily rhythm. Men learned to read the sounds of incoming shells, distinguishing the lighter crack of a gas round from the heavier concussion of high explosive. All sides began mixing gas shells into standard barrages to disguise them, and the architecture of survival worked against you. The deep dugouts that protected soldiers from artillery fragments were exactly the places where heavier-than-air gases pooled and concentrated. You could stay in your dugout and risk being gassed, or you could come up into the open and risk being shelled. There was no safe option. Gas masks improved steadily over the course of the war, but they were never comfortable, never perfectly reliable, and wearing them during an actual firefight added its own layer of difficulty. Every man wearing one was also quietly wondering whether the seal was right, whether the filter was still effective, whether what he was breathing through it was actually clean. By the time the armistice came, all sides combined had deployed roughly 125,000 tons of chemical agents across approximately 39 different formulations. The primary ones remained chlorine, phosgene, and mustard. Total casualties from chemical weapons reached around 1.3 million, with approximately 100,000 deaths. Those who survived often carried physical damage, scarred lung tissue, chronic respiratory problems, long-term eye damage that shaped the rest of their lives. Gas shells ultimately made up around 30% of all artillery ammunition used by major powers before the war ended. That volume of fire left a problem that has not been fully resolved more than a century later. Estimates suggest that approximately 13 million unexploded chemical munitions remain buried beneath the farmland of France and Belgium. Around 16 million acres were formally restricted after the war, and parts of that area remain under strict controls today. Every year, farmers turning soil in those regions unearth shells from the war. Some are ordinary duds. Some still contain active chemical agents, corroded, fragile, and entirely capable of doing what they were designed to do. More than 630 French ordnance disposal personnel have been killed clearing this material since 1946, and civilian casualties continue to be recorded. The post-war solution for large stockpiles of chemical munitions, in both world wars, was ocean dumping. Hundreds of thousands of tons of agents in corroding steel casings now sit on the seafloor. Salt water does not neutralize them. It breaks down the containers. Fishermen have pulled mustard gas shells up in their nets. At least 91 have been recorded as injured from that contact. The effects on marine ecosystems are harder to measure but no less real. It is a strange thing to sit with. The knowledge that decisions made in desperation between 1915 and 1918 are still producing consequences today, still injuring people, still contaminating ground and water. The war that was supposed to end all wars left behind a chemistry problem that outlasted every soldier who fought in it. What do you think about the use of chemical weapons in World War I? Leave your comment down below. If you found this video interesting, leave a like and subscribe for more dark history.